Okay, hi, and welcome back to uh, an in-depth summary of John McWhorter's book, Power of Babel. This is chapter 6. Some languages get genetically altered and frozen. So, recall from previous chapters that spoken language is especially susceptible to change, right? That is why there's no such thing as a language. It never sits still long enough. And so it is at best a dialect. That having been said, linguistic change, except perhaps in the case of slang, happens so gradually for most of us as to be imperceptible. We don't feel it. However, there are some non Western languages where such change can be seen within one human lifetime. Um, if you'd like an in depth look at such a language, make sure to read pages 217 to 219, at least in the edition I'm using. Okay, suffice to say, this particular language changed in basic grammar from 1930 to the time McWhorter's book was published in 2003. People alive today can remember their grandparents and great grandparents speaking a similar yet different language. Um, Today, of course, at least in the Western world, such rapid changes is unthinkable, right? However, for reasons discussed earlier, writing, formal education, etc., language change is happening far more slowly now than it did in, say, Shakespeare's time. 500 years before his time, Shakespeare, who spoke what we now call early modern English, would have had to learn that dialect of English called Middle English, right? The English spoken 500 years before him, as a separate language. Whereas we can handle his language, right? Sure, it's not fully familiar. Some words are obsolete, some words we don't use anymore. Um, but we don't need a translation, right? We don't need, um, a dictionary would be useful, but we don't need it, right? A speaker of English can pick up, a Shakespearean book and read it. Um, so yeah, writing especially has had a lot to do with this, which we've talked about in previous chapters. As McWhorter claims, quote, that sense that the written variety of a language is the one, then, is due not to anything inherently superior about that version, but to the seductive power that anything has by sheer virtue of its having been there first, as long as the means are available to keep its image available in perpetuity. Page 223, right? Again, we go back to this notion of luck, right? Sometimes a language or a dialect happens to be at the right place at the right time, right? But that does not mean that there's anything superior about it. And that's important to keep in mind. Of course, despite all efforts of standardization by teachers, institutions, and so on, language change still occurs, right? However, it is now changing at a much slower pace, at least for some languages. Sometimes, however, an interesting compromise, if you will, arises. Oftentimes, the spoken language moves on, leaving the written language behind. That is why in languages like English and French, orthography and pronunciation, for the most part, don't seem to agree. More than this, though, especially in French, the spoken variety now has unwritten rules of its own. So if you speak exactly as you write, you will certainly be branded an outsider. You must remove some grammatical markers and change others to sound natural in speaking. Okay? Likewise in English, okay? I mean, English speakers will be familiar with this, right? You must use contractions. Well, not must, but I mean, but for the most part, right? The general rule is if you're speaking, you need to use contractions. If you're not, you are, but if you're going to sound like a native speaker, all of this is further proof that language can, must, and does change, right? Okay. Still, as McWhorter writes, quote, how this gap retards language change is that the very existence of the written variety has a way of keeping the spoken language from moving along as quickly as it would otherwise, even if it does advance somewhat as spoken French has. Page 226. Let's look at an example in English. In standard English, everyone knows that it's you were, not you was. The word you started life as the plural version of the singular thou, a word that has not been spoken in everyday speech since 1700. Okay, became obsolete a long time ago. Arbitrarily, it was decided that even though you can now be used to talk either about one person or two or more people, it must retain its original agreement with a plural verb, right? This was arbitrary, okay? It could easily have been you was, but it wasn't, right? It became you were. So there's nothing logical about this. There's nothing illogical, right? But there's nothing logical. Okay, it was simply that some influential grammarians at the time decided that you was simply had to go, right? If one were to be logical, the singular forms should be I was, you was, he, she, it was, while the plural forms would be we were, you were, they were, right? I mean, that would have made more sense. But were it not for writing, the spoken language would have almost certainly taken this course, where you was became the standard. However, McWhorter informs us that, and I quote, "What we possess as the soul of respectability in the language of our moment, then, is ultimately merely this year's fashions, with the fashions of a certain year frozen into place by widespread literacy." Page 231. Said another way, there are numerous grammatical paths a language can take, and usually someone pushes it in one direction or another, even though no direction is intrinsically superior, right? Think of double negatives, for instance. Like, I haven't seen nobody. English frowns upon such constructions, but in many languages they are required, right? So although English views them as illogical, two negatives make a positive, right? The thinking goes, especially if you're thinking of it mathematically, right? So two negatives make a positive. Doesn't make sense. One negative is enough. English speakers are barred from using the negative emphatically in a way that is possible in other languages, right? So sure, one negative gets the idea across, but two negatives could help us emphasize, right, what we're trying to say. But you can't do that in English. To illustrate, in some languages, sometimes by using more than one negative marker, a speaker may emphasize just how negative, right? Just how impossible something is. Okay, we now move on to a different point. I quote, that spoken language, rather than being a pale reflection of written language, is actually a distinct realm with its own structures and aesthetic standards. Page 238. It is pointless to ask, in other words, which is superior, writing or speaking, right? It's a moot question. It's a fool's game, really. Each is appropriate in certain contexts, to different audiences, and so on. For instance, in writing, redundancy is, and rightly so, frowned upon, right? Because if you want to go back to something, it's there. You can go back to it, right? But I quote, in spoken language, a moderate degree of redundancy and repetition is a communicative plus, rendering dramatic contour and calling attention to the concepts the speaker wants to stress. Page 238. On the other hand, quote, writing requires us to be more explicit. Page 238. Okay, so a different medium for a different purpose for a different audience. They are different, right? They're not, one is not, superior or inferior. We take for granted today that writing and speaking exist simultaneously, but this has only been the case relatively recently. Needless to say, speaking predates writing by, hundreds of thousands of years at best, right? I mean, at least. Writing has only been around for about 6,000 years. So we consider writing to be the pinnacle of linguistic achievement. But that's only because we have proof of it, right? We can examine it, we can discuss it, we can compare it, right? But the importance we attribute to writing is in fact disproportionate, right? Because language, i.e., its spoken part, has been around for at least 150,000 years, meaning that writing contributes barely 4% of that timeline, and most likely even less. Okay? Because remember, 150,000 years is a conservative estimate. It's more or less confirmed. But it may go back, who knows, right? Who knows how long before people actually started speaking. McWhorter writes, I quote, clearly, spoken language was not waiting for written conventions to come along and tighten it up. Rather, written language conventions and the tendency for educated speech to then mimic them are an artificial add-on to human language. Page 239. Put another way, I quote again, writing creates new ways of speaking. Page 235. We have been conditioned, for lack of a better word, to accept that the written word is the ultimate authority when it comes to language. But in fact, in the case of English, what we would recognize today as good writing, in other words, familiar writing, only came about in the 1600s. It is clear then that writing conventions are something a language doesn't need, but nonetheless benefits from having. Still, we can never speak the way we write, right? I quote, we speak in idea packets, or better yet, when we try to spin out longer propositions, we risk being interrupted because our subconscious rules of discourse are founded on an expectation that people will talk in spurts. As a rule, in casual conversation, human beings do not, and never have, spoken in tightly constructed sentences and carefully bounded paragraphs. Page 243. It is worth mentioning at this point, although this was previously touched on in another chapter, that societies that have not developed a written form of their language are by no means backward, nor are their languages primitive. If anything, non-urban societies often have more colorful, not to mention complex languages. Their languages are meant to be taken in solely by the ears, while those of urban societies are meant for both the ears and eyes. No variety is superior, just different, each serving different needs. With this, chapter 6 comes to an end. So, the next chapter, chapter 7, will be the last one. See you.